ISF overview that was in the files pod. Since the webinar started before we started broadcasting, so that recording started playing instead of us. That recording was playing. And then once we started, people were listening to the recording, and that recording also was showing up above the link where they should click to go into Zoom if they're having audio issues. So
you moved it out of the pod.
So that recording was causing all kinds of issues. So we got it taken out, and then it seemed like people figured things out. So
okay, and then we'll check it tonight, and then we'll know what we need to. Hi, Casey.
I think Brian went in and figured it out already, Lucille. Like I was chatting to our tech group, and
no one knew that was a situation that could happen. So now we know.
All right, so I'm going to be quiet, and I will try to help with question and answers, and I will do my best to monitor the chat, but I'm not that good.
I have a system worked out, Lucille, so I gotcha.
I see that you do, and I hope Susan uses your same system this afternoon. You know, I think I've exhausted my tech skills.
Yeah, and hi, Casey.
Hey.
Hello. I don't think we're going to get as many people. I think the word trauma brought in the droves, but we did have 740 people in the last webinar of this strand. But we had the word trauma in it, and I was not thinking about the fact there were 740 people. I just think about the fact that there's 10 people. So, yeah. But I don't think we'll get that many because I think the word trauma brought in a lot of interlopers.
Hey, Casey, will you be able to rename your
Oh yeah, sure.
Should
I put my credential?
And we're recording now. We know that.
Oh.
Thanks, Katie. Welcome, everyone. We are in our second session for the ISF strand, and we're really happy that you are joining us. My name is Susan Barrett, and I am one of the lead presenters for this session, moving from co-located mental health in schools to a single system of social emotional behavior support. I am joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Patty Hirschfeld, and we are both from the Center of Social Behavior Support at Old Dominion University. I'm also joined by our exemplars today, Casey Rodenbush from the Behavioral Health Services Department in Monterey County, and Haley Newman from the Salinas Union High School District out of Monterey, California. And we're, again, very happy that you've joined us. I am going to kick us off. We want to remind you that the new content that we're going to be delivering for you today is only good when it gets applied inside a teaming process so that you can figure out how to take that new content and apply it in your culture and context in the settings that you're working in. So we want to make sure that as a team, and you're taking this content back, that you consider a couple of questions on how to make this work in your setting and how to make room for this work in your setting by eliminating maybe something that's not as effective. So again, we want to make sure that we're working together as a team, even though we might be listening in as an individual. This session is the second of 3 sessions today for our strand, and hopefully you were able to join us for our first session. And Lucille Eber took us through kind of an introduction to ISF, the Interconnected Systems Framework, because we have a lot of folks that are new to this term and new to our conference. So if you want to build a little bit of fluency with the Interconnected System Framework, you can go back and listen to that recording later on today or tonight or tomorrow. It will be available for you. We want to also remind you to please engage with us during this session. We'd love to hear from you. So we have opportunities for you to chat. We also have in the poll section opportunities for you to post questions. We will be taking the last 15 minutes of this session to answer your questions. So we would love to hear from you, so please engage. and interact with us. And if you happen to click on something inadvertently, please come back to join us, and we've given you information about how to navigate back to our area to join the session again. And also just to remind everybody that we do have support available, and you can go on that blue bar at the top of your screen and click on the help desk to get any time or any help with any of the questions that you might have with technology. Okay, so we have been providing learning expectations through the conference so far, and I wanted to augment or provide a little bit of an adjustment to the learning expectations for this session. And we want to focus on self-care expectations and self-care behaviors. We know that there is an increased amount of stress given the multiple crises that we're facing right now. And we want to be sure that for our adults, we're taking good care of each other. And so from an adult perspective, make sure that you are safe, engaged, and respectful, which means that you're creating an emotional support team for yourself. Make sure you're double checking on friends, and make sure that we're calling attention to a suicide hotline if you feel a sense of hopelessness. We also want to make sure that you know that there was some legislation that was passed earlier this week that just put forward a 988 hotline. Unfortunately, that won't be available till for a couple of years now, but we want to put that on your radar for future. We also want to make sure that you're engaged today. So be aware of your stress level, pay attention to joy, and take some movement breaks and hydrate. Nobody's on camera, so you can move and walk around and stretch as you listen to this session. And finally, be respectful. Nurture your body with healthy food, build calming routines for sleep, and build routines for daily exercise. So we really want to model this kind of self-care as we take our journey through the interconnected systems framework. All right, so to set the stage, we already kind of were very much aware that we had a crisis, mental health crisis already in motion prior to COVID. And so we wanted to share and take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the data pieces even prior to COVID that we were really concerned about. We knew that prior to COVID, 1 in 5 youth had a mental health condition. We also know that 50%, perhaps 80% get no treatment. Of those who get treatment, 23% are getting that treatment within schools. We just had a new research document, a lit review that let us know that was, I think, posted through the SMART Center at the University of Washington. We know that if students receive services inside schools, they're 6 times more likely to receive evidence-based treatment, and they're much more likely to finish out the treatment when it's conducted inside schools. We know that juvenile justice system is the next level system default. We know that suicide is the second leading cause of death among young adults in the US. And we know that there are many factors that impact mental health. So we want to really, as we deliberately partner with our behavioral health systems, we want to make sure that we're looking up and looking at the patterns within our communities that are emerging, because there are round the clock factors that contribute to the success of our students within our school environment. So it's going to be really important to kind of take that balcony view and look at patterns that are emerging within the community. And if we can predict it, we can prevent it, right? If we can see that trend emerging within our community, we know it's going to land in our schools. So how do we strengthen and fortify what we've promoted in Tier 1 to make sure that we can meet the vast majority of need? We also are seeing some of our Department of Health, like in Washington State, give us some of these predictions. And what they're letting us know that just with COVID-19, that we should definitely expect an increased surge in mental health symptoms, that it will likely be seen in phases, and that we should expect an increase of depressive symptoms peaking around November and December of 2020, with the highest risk of suicide likely to take place between October and December, which is why we really want to elevate this notion of putting that suicide hotline out there, making sure that we are checking in on friends, and making sure we're taking care of each other over the fall and winter months of this year. We also know, even before COVID and really right now, that interconnected system framework is really about disrupting the status quo. even before COVID, our systems were not working for every single person within our community. So now more than ever, we as individuals have to push back and question whether or not our systems and structures that we're establishing within our communities are working. Because one thing we know for sure is that COVID-19 is impacting our Black, Brown, and migrant communities and our other vulnerable populations at higher rates than others. And this is rooted in the social inequalities that have taken place for generations, particularly around residential segregation and differential access to healthcare and treatment. So we need to remind ourselves that race is not the risk factor. Racism is the risk factor. For more information about increasing racial equities and doing our part and identifying specific steps that we can take, we wanted to offer a link to our equity statement by our Technical Assistance Center. Today, it has never been more clear that we need an increased response, but when we increase that response, it will require us to redesign the system. So I wanted to give a couple of examples about some of the common responses we're seeing in our communities as we look at this staggering wave of need coming at us. And we're seeing many of our systems around our country spend some of their dollars on hiring social emotional experts, which is fantastic. We actually need more social emotional experts. But we know that that's not going to be good enough. It's not going to match the magnitude of the problem. So as we think about using the MTSS logic with this approach, we not only want to hire social emotional experts, we want to adapt their roles within our school community to be completely embedded into the fabric of our education community. And we want to adapt their role to include building the capacity of every single staff member in our schools to feel more comfortable, confident, and have the skills to be able to teach social emotional competencies within our classroom settings. And we want our social emotional experts to have the flexibility in their role to serve with our teams across all tiers of support and implementation. Another common response is we're seeing many of our systems strengthen our partnerships with our families and our community providers. Again, amazing. This is an amazing advance in what we need to do. But if we use the MTSS logic, we're going to do a better job of designing one set of teams and bringing those families and community partners into an existing tier 1 team and letting the data that we get from the community settings guide and inform our efforts across all tiers. So yes, the common responses are great, but they'll be better when we install it within an MTSS logic. So let's set the stage for this interconnected system framework. It is the deliberate application of the multi-tiered PBIS framework for all social emotional behavior interventions, right? We want to align all of those related initiatives through one system. And too often when a new term kind of pops up that becomes popular, like trauma-informed practices, for instance, we create a different separate team. And in doing so, we silo off limited resources. And so how do we make sure that we're staying with our tier 1 team, but expanding to inform efforts? So we want to move away from a co-located system to a single system of delivery. And in doing so, it's going to require us to change our memorandum of understanding and our service agreements with our community providers, if you're lucky enough to have such an agreement. We want everything to be delivered and monitored through one set of teams where we have our community and school-based clinicians actively participating with us and reviewing data and ensuring an effective system at the school level. The interconnected systems framework is also guided by 4 key messages. Again, that single set of teams, the notion that mental health is for all, right? We all need specific skills to navigate the stressors in life. And we also all need skills to be able to have an instructional approach as we teach social, emotional, behavior competencies right alongside our academic content. We want to make sure we're moving beyond just counting the number of kids who are accessing services to making sure that students and staff and families are benefiting from what we're providing them, that their life outcomes are better, and that we're holding ourselves accountable for high quality fidelity of implementation. And then finally, we're going to make sure that we install a mental health approach using the MTSS core features. We know in the past that we have a history of really weak connections with our community providers. So we need to systematically review our current service agreements with our partners, our memorandum of understanding to clarify the rules for systemic integration. We want to make sure that we have the flexibility in our funding and in our policy to allow for integration of our mental health personnel to be included in our school teams across all tiers, and not just kind of situated within our schools and conducting business within an office space. We want to pull and embed them into the fabric of our community. So to illustrate this a little bit more, we want to interview Casey Rodenbush, our friend and colleague in Monterey County, to talk about the story of how they began their journey with the Interconnected Systems Framework. To do this, I'm going to stop our slideshow, and I want to invite Casey to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role and tell us a little bit about Monterey County.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everyone. I'm Casey Rodenbush. I'm a services manager for Monterey County Behavioral Health, and I manage a very large team of clinicians and supervisors, support staff, and we have some interns, and we serve 25 school districts in Monterey County. And you may think of Monterey County, and what comes to mind for many people is the beautiful coastline, which we definitely have that on our peninsula, but we also are one of the main producers of, we have a lot of agriculture. So a lot of our crops feed the country on a daily basis. And so we have the families and the workers that make that possible. A high average of our student population is from the migrant community. And then our schools vary from our high schools can have like 2,800 students. And then we can also move into our more rural parts of our county, which is in the southern region, and have schoolhouses of under 100 students. So we have a wide range of territory and a lot of different student populations that we're working with.
Great, thank you, Casey. I know that you were fairly new to your role when you attended or learned about the Interconnected System Framework, and you got to hear Dr. Lucille Eber, right, that during one of our implementer forums. Can you talk about what you heard that was different than how you were currently operating?
Yes, my first exposure of PBIS was actually coming to this conference in 2015. At the time, I had just moved into a management role, and as a clinician by trade and practice originally, I was naturally drawn to all the mental health strands. So I found myself swimming through all of the educational sessions and looking for those mental health strands, and I landed in all of the ISF sessions. And what was inspiring to me is I just loved all the talk about changing the role of the mental health clinician and moving them from just seeing students on in their offices and in an office setting to being more part of the school community. And what I did know, because I had been working as a clinician in the program when I was hired and then became a supervisor, I had a good understanding of the school system and then also the county behavioral health system and all the different populations that we serve through the county. And so I knew what with all that, we had all the right ingredients in Monterey County. We had great partnerships in place. We had just also expanded our contracts from, we were only serving students in special education, and we developed MOUs with several school districts to start serving students in general education. So we had both populations to work with. I had a lot of staff, great partnerships, and now we had a guide, thank goodness, to all the work that had been done to develop the interconnected systems framework. And then it also did help that I had recently been promoted to manager. And what we know is with the ISF is that we need key stakeholders involved. And so as a decision maker, I had the authority to start making the changes that I knew needed to be made. Also, our County Office of Education had recently been awarded a school climate transformation grant. And so behavioral health was getting more involved in the PBIS implementation because we had an increase in our contracts and we were starting to serve more students.
So it seems like there were so many things that were in place and that you had really strong partnerships, but I love that you went from being a clinician to being in a management kind of position where you kind of had the authority to make some changes in the structures and systems, which is really important. I also know from some of the background with Monterey County that there was at the county level a multidisciplinary team that existed. And so when the school climate transformation grant came online, they pulled that grant in right into that team. So can you talk a little bit about what happened next? I know that Esther Rubio was leading that team and the County Office of Education. So can you talk a little bit about how you connected with her and some of the things that you did to move away from a co-located to that more of an integrated style of working with the clinicians inside the schools?
Yeah, so once we went to the conference, MCOE and many districts were there with us. I joined the team, that school climate transformation team. And also I was trained to be a youth mental health first aid instructor along with Esther. So Esther was responsible for overseeing the grant funding and then also being the chair of that school climate leadership team. So she and I together started doing a lot of training for school staff, a lot of classified staff. And so the more adults that we trained in the schools, from the bus drivers to the registrars to people that worked in the cafeteria, we were just amazed at just seeing these light bulbs come on for people, because many educators don't get any training in trauma. And we were at the time and in our community, we had really high rates of community violence. And so we were finding that the more information that we gave to these adults that had interaction with these kids every day, the better, because then they were in a better position to be able to help. And so the more that we were able to train the adults that were trying to implement the PBIS framework in the schools, the more that we were able to see that they were in a position to help, because we can't just rely on the clinicians to be the primary provider for the mental health supports for the students, because there's just so many students that need the help.
I love that you're able to put those folks in positions so that they were building and growing the capacity of many more adults to be able to take ownership and be kind of the mental health ambassadors. So that's a really key piece.
Yeah, so what we did, so with our, what I had to do with the model, because one of the things that we had to do, I had to change our model. And so I had to take part of what I was doing with trying to understand the program and how it was designed is I had to look at how we were serving the students to begin with. So originally when we had, the way that the program was designed is I had two separate teams. I had clinicians that were serving only general education, and then another team that was serving students with IEPs. And so in order for us to start making the changes for the clinicians, I had to get a good sense of what was happening. And so what was going on originally before I started making changes is that all this, we had two separate teams, and then the clinicians would be crossing different, multiple different school districts in one day. So they weren't connected to any given school district. So some of them would provide a service, one service for a student on one school, and then go across town to see another student in another school. So there was no really coordination to what we were doing. And so what I decided to do before I started making the changes is talk to everybody, talk to the staff, interview them, understand what it is that what were their passions? What did they love to do? What was it that brought them to this work? Because some clinicians aren't, some love middle school, some would prefer to work with elementary school students. And so what's important to me as a leader is to really understand what the staff enjoy doing, because if they enjoy what the work that they're doing, then they're going to do a better job. And then the other part of this was really helping them understand the value of what they had to offer to the school districts, because what we're trying to do is really merge two very different cultures. We have school culture and mental health culture. And so the novel idea with ISF is bringing your community partners to the table. So in behavioral health, because we are a system of care, and we serve the entire county of Monterey through our services, whether that's kids that have been placed on probation or kids that are in the child welfare system. Behavioral health serves those systems as well. So what we want to be able to do is decrease the duplication of service as much as possible, and then work in a more focused and efficient way. And so as I started to get the clinicians to understand that this change was part of the process, then I started to get a little bit more engagement and buy-in from them.
That's awesome. I love how you interviewed them and made sure that the decisions you were making, you were empowering them to have kind of that choice and ownership over the decisions that were getting made. I also love in the journey, as you're describing, that when you brought those two systems together, you took time to kind of examine the current effort and figure out things that were working and things that weren't working. And that's, these are big staffing changes. So how did you ensure that beyond kind of that initial interviewing process where you're asking them where they best had passion for, how else did you make the staff feel comfortable with these big changes?
Well, change, if we want to change, we have to change. And I also have grown to learn that people will become uncomfortable with change. And just because they're uncomfortable with it doesn't mean that I'm going to stop what I'm doing. Because one thing I have heard, I was in the other session earlier, and this work has been going on for 20 years. And it takes being relentless and really focusing on what the overall goal is health and wellness of our learning communities. And so for me as a leader, I just had to stay the course, create the conditions for change, and just be patient and allow the process to happen. And it just started to evolve over time. So rather than if I had clinicians that were upset or not really getting behind what the movement was, what I did know is I had a whole other leadership community behind me. So we had the districts across the county that were invested in this as well. And the relationships that I had established with all of the other community agencies that are involved with us, was completely confident that we were going to be able to accomplish what we were trying to accomplish. It just took some time. I had to be patient and allow for the discomfort and not let that rattle me in any way, and just continue on.
What kind of supports, training and coaching were provided to the clinicians?
So initially, with the PBIS grant funding, there were always these regular implementation trainings that the county office was they did all the training and technical assistance. So I would have the clinicians initially, my team, those clinicians that were serving the districts that were implementing PBIS, they would go to the trainings that were hosted by the county office, and they would be full day trainings. And the clinicians would get into, the first step was getting them into the room. And so when we got them into the training room, the first, few, or I'd say the first year, they would always sit in the very back of the room, and they would be not interacting with the school district staff, and really just confused as to why they were there. And I would imagine probably these school personnel and staff were also wondering why behavioral health was in the room. And so over time that changed. And as the clinicians started to understand how their expertise was able to inform this work, they started to build the relationships with the school staff. And so the more they developed the relationships with the school staff, they saw the value of their partnership. And then over time, it just started to change. And so we would go into new school years, and I would continue to have to make adjustments based on the feedback that I was getting. And so the other thing is I had to train them on our service model. So what I did with our service model is I shifted it from just one-on-one therapy to aligning it with the 3 tiers of the PBIS framework. And I included a very robust menu of mental health training at the tier 1 level, because we know that the more adults that we can train in mental health, the better. So that was a lot of time and energy has gone into training, and we're doing more training now than ever. And so what I'm finding is the adults they need the information and they benefit from it, and they continue to ask for more.
Yeah, and I think one of the distinction, it's not just training the staff, it's the time to be able to apply that new content in an action planning process that the team is designing. So it tees it up. So yes, I got this training, and now I know how to apply it every day in my classrooms, and I'm getting fidelity checks on it, and I'm making sure that students are benefiting from it. So again, it's that, yes, we're going to train, and we're going to do it within kind of that MTSS or PBIS system to make sure that that new content is actually enacted and implemented and students benefit. So I love that you talk about the journey of having, moving from having your clinicians kind of in the back of the training sessions, and now they're sitting with the teams and they're kind of part of the fabric of the community. Can you talk a little bit about that journey a little bit more?
I can. And I would say with getting the clinicians, I would say one of the biggest challenges is really having them incorporated into the teams. It was a journey, because it's one thing to have them all attend a big training with everybody. And then it's quite another to really have them become part of the teaming process at the site level. And so in order to integrate these clinicians into the climate and culture of the site communities, I have to credit Esther Rubio for this a lot, because the school districts that were implementing PBIS, they trusted her, and they had been working with her for much longer. And I was a little bit newer to this work. And so anytime I would have challenges in getting the clinicians to be incorporated into the teaming process at the site level, I would let Esther know. She'd help be a bridge between me and the site administration. And she and I would actually work together, and we acted as an ISF consulting team. And we would go around to the different knowledge development sites that we had been setting up as pilot sites for this work, and help them along. We'd meet on a monthly basis. So rather than us going into the site level regular team meetings, we found that it was more effective than the two of that she and I paired up, and we would be like coaches for the site admin and the other people that were leading the movement in the buildings.
Awesome. I love the level of technical assistance that you had a co-team that you had a person representing mental health and a person representing education, and leading kind of a co-coaching unit and giving really specific guidance to the school level. and intensifying the technical assistance as needed. That's awesome. So what kind of feedback have you gotten from this switch and this change that you've done?
I've got excuse me, amazing feedback. So I continued the world tour that I mentioned. I called it's my world tour. I go around every school year. I start around March. This year it was a virtual world tour. And I really want to keep a good read on the pulse of the staff. So I know how it is, how they enjoy the work, and how I can tell they enjoy the work is every year when I go and I meet with them, most often the clinicians want to stay at the sites that they've been assigned to. So I also think it's important to mention that the districts, we have Haley Newman from our Salinas Union High School district. That is one of our most successful districts that we've worked with, and their patients and buy-in with us. They were so engaged and with PBIS, and then once I started working with the administration and explaining what ISF was and what I was trying to get started, I recall going in I was 2 years into this, and I had to basically pitch it and sell it to the districts that hey, I'm going to be integrating the services. I'm going to be blending, and the clinicians are going to be serving both populations. And I remember going into the second year to meet with the assistant superintendent, and I was saying, okay, so this ISF thing, I'm working on it. It's still a process. It's going to take some time. And she remembered me presenting it to her the year before. And she said, Casey, you have me at Interconnected. So here we are now, and I can go into the same kind of training environment that we've been doing all along with these larger trainings. And I can walk into a room where the clinicians were originally sitting in the back of the room together. And now they are embedded in each school team. So we have school teams that will sit in tables, and I can enter the room and I see them all embedded in these school teams, and it's a beautiful thing. And they're talking to each other, they're laughing, they actually have become part of the community. So we get them out of their therapy rooms, out into the school community, pushing into classrooms, talking about what to do when you're feeling anxious or depressed, or how do you access mental health services. And so the feedback is really, I can see it visually. I can see the smiles on the faces of the clinicians when they talk about the work that they do. And I also get positive feedback from the school sites and the administration. So the feedback is 360 degrees. I have to work with everybody, because what I do know is that we need every last person, and we get through this together. And so we're finding more and more that the more that the adults are working together, the healthier our school communities are becoming.
That's great. And so you mentioned a little bit about taking the world tour in a virtual way. Can you talk a little bit about how COVID has kind of changed things, and a little bit about how you're dealing with that?
Yes, COVID. So many of us had to pivot so quickly. It was very, I think what I've noticed I'm just so impressed with the staff. We've had to be extremely flexible, and we've had to adapt and shift the way that we're accessing students, because now before it was much easier to go onto campus and provide a service, pull a student from instruction. And now these instruction, we don't have that ability to do that in the same way. And so we're having to offer supports and services at different times of the day than we typically were before. And really engaging with parents a lot more before, because the services primarily were being provided on the school sites. We didn't have a lot of interaction with the parents, and now they're absolutely engaged. And the clinicians, I've heard my last world tour, I heard that more than anything is that the clinicians were really appreciating having the engagement involvement from the parents, because before it wasn't as accessible. So that's a really beautiful thing. And I just think that now more than ever, we're seeing this, that we need to heal as a community. And so the more that we can connect and we can bring the people in the districts together and support them together, then this is how we're going to to move forward and continue to innovate, because I see that we are now, everyone has pretty much adapted for the most part to this, and now we're getting ready for this next wave. And so schools are going to start to reopen eventually, and now we're going to be I think evaluating the way we were working before, and probably carrying over some of these practices into our work moving forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Casey. We're getting a lot of questions about funding and about the relationship with school-based clinicians, the school employed clinicians like the school counselors and the school social workers, and their role. And I just want to say, we will be answering questions during the last 15 minutes of this session. I did want to answer one question about who Esther Rubio is and what her role is. And she's with the County Office of Education, and she serves as the PDIS MTSS coordinator. And so having her kind of lead the education team and expanding their team to include behavioral health was part of that journey of aligning into that single system of support. So thanks for the question around asking who Esther was. I'm sorry, we didn't clarify that more. The other thing I want to do, and Haley, if you can switch us over to the side. I know a lot of you have many questions about how to get this started, and we wanted to make sure that you knew that there was a resource that might be helpful as we talk about all the different changing roles of staff in this interconnected system framework. And so there's two discussion guides that we want to provide you. One is at the district level and talking about how to rearrange the roles and how to solidify the roles at the district level. And then we also have a discussion guide at the school level that will help drive some of the dialogue and questions related to that and related to funding. And again, we will spend the last 15 minutes of our session answering the other questions that you have in the chat and in the Q&A pod. So we really appreciate you engaging with us. So right now I want to turn it over to Dr. Patty Hirschfeld, another one of our colleagues who's leading at the national level many of the high school work that's going on. So Patty, I'll turn it over to you, my friend.
Thanks, Susan. And thank you, Casey, for sharing all of that information, and your enthusiasm permeates all the way through Zoom. So that's awesome. Like Susan said, I tend to concentrate a lot of my efforts on working with high schools specifically. And what I think is really exciting is specific to Monterey County and Salinas Union High School District is, as Casey said, it was really two of the high schools that really latched onto this work and have been pretty much, I guess, exemplar in nature. And so I just want to give us a few minutes to talk about the context specific to really anything school-wide when we talk high school at the school level. And then Haley will have the rest of the time to share some examples, which will get at some of the questions that Kelly has been sharing with us. So this visual is actually represented in chapter 2 of a high school monograph, and that document is in the file pod. And Bridget Flannery and Mimi Cato at the University of Oregon, I think, did a phenomenal job of capturing some of those contextual considerations that make implementation unique in a high school setting. And so the graphic here suggests or represents down the left column that we need to be thinking specifically and considering size, culture, and developmental level specific to high schools. And I'm going to expand on those in just a second. The center, the gears here in the center represent the key foundational systems. And we know data is plentiful, and I would argue probably more plentiful in high school. So really being able to be fluent with data and being able to streamline what data best informs your work is a critical consideration. Leadership also sometimes quite different. High schools, I've met high schools in some parts of the Midwest that have 16 assistant principals. And so there's a whole new conversation and strategy that has to happen when you have 16 or a team of administrators, because we know how important administrator engagement is. And then the communication aspect, and that because oftentimes schools are larger, not always, that making sure that all of the information regarding said school-wide reform effort, what have you, is reaching all the adults and all the stakeholders. And so communication is a consideration. So sometimes we see high schools doing things a little different. However, that very familiar triangle and 3 concentric circles in the middle, that's the research that tells us that we know this works. And so while we definitely have a little bit of deviation sometimes from some of the straightforward ways that we might think about implementing, we cannot steer so far from research that we step outside of what we know works based on science. So the next slide, I want to break down those considerations just a little bit. First, and really thinking about these in terms of ISF and in terms of this partnership that's occurring between mental health and education. Certainly size is a consideration, and I do recognize that not all high schools are mega high schools. The schools in Salinas Union High School, and specifically I have some familiarity with Salinas Union or Salinas High School, they are, as Casey said, larger high schools. But for certain, typically high schools are larger, they have a larger number of students than the feeder schools. And so that in of itself allows or really requires us to have some additional considerations. Susan talked about fortifying tier 1. And so making sure, just given the sheer numbers, that in doing so, we lessen the need or the number of students who need more intensive support. And that also applies to the faculty and staff that are potentially larger in number. The other consideration, there are oftentimes more resources, more people involved with our high school students. They're oftentimes in the workforce. So we have employers. They're in the community far more, at least independently, than our younger students. So there is a larger group of adults interacting with our students. And again, that needs to be a consideration. And if we table this in the right way, those are additional resources that we could access on behalf of our work. And then the student supports as well kind of follows that same thinking. The next influence or consideration is the culture. And I'll just speak to this briefly, but essentially, and I'm a former high school teacher, and my training was specific to my content area. And I do know there was a question earlier about buy-in and how do you, I guess, convince, if you will, some teachers to get on board with this. And I do know Haley will talk a little bit about that, but I kind of have 2 thoughts. First of all, I would argue that high school teachers, secondary teachers, are never taught those skills around SEB, social emotional behavioral instruction, are not a part of our pre-service training. And so to assume that we're going to offer up a social emotional behavioral curriculum or strategy and have teachers run with it is not a fair assumption to the teachers. And so the systems piece requires that we provide that support to the teachers so that they can be successful. And I can remember a conversation at one of the high schools around mindfulness, just using mindfulness at tier 1. And there was a good amount of pushback from the adults because it was a very unfamiliar approach. And so really concentrating on that support for the adults and not assuming that they won't do it, right? But perhaps they need support in being able to carry that out. So I'm always one to boil it down to skills. What are the skills necessary that teachers need to have to carry this work, specifically this work around social emotional behavioral learning, into the classroom? The other consideration with that is obviously content. We have a pacing guide. There's, very rigorous in some cases, adherence to that pacing guide. And so really the important approach to that is making sure that this work is embedded within the curriculum. So how do you take some of this instruction and make it a part of the work you're doing in the classroom? And the final consideration is around developmental level. And there are so many things that go into being an adolescent to being a teenager. And, now as Susan talked to us at the very beginning about this heightened need for support. And Casey talked about looking out for one another and, communing in that respect. And so this is such an important consideration always with teenagers, but even now more so. And so being, kind of thinking about what are those developmental points, landmarks, if you will, that we know make up the adolescent developmental process. So really being in tune with that. So with that, I want to turn this over to Haley.
All right, thank you so much, Patty. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward. So now that we've talked about the various systems from the top down, as was mentioned in the comments, I'm going to be talking about what this looks like in our high school district. So building on what Patty said, specifically for high schools, what this looks like. And so I would be remiss if I wouldn't start with who is doing the work. So we are a high school district. We have high schools, middle schools, and we also have alternative ed schools as well. And so with our district, the first team that we have is our district PBIS advisory team. And this is comprised of different leadership roles in our district. It's comprised of different levels of leads. But the most important part is that Monterey County Behavioral Health, there's a clinical supervisor that sits on our advisory team. And so that clinical supervisor helps oversee the different clinicians that are school-based in our district. On that team is also Esther Rubio, who is from Monterey County Office of Education. So we are utilizing them and consulting in order to implement this mental health support and embed it in our PBIS framework. We also have the district PBIS coordinator, which is myself, that helps oversee the PBIS framework at different sites, as well as the ISF integration, specifically at our 2 demo sites, which I'll go more into in the next slide. We also have, with our PBIS framework, tier 2-3 leads or coordinators. Usually our mental health clinicians are members of that tier 2-3 team, but they aren't limited to those tiers. And so I'll talk more about that as well. And then we do have facilitators that are in charge of particular interventions under that tier 2-3 umbrella. Okay, and of course we have to have our triangle in here with the different levels of support. So aligning with the interconnected systems framework, we want to utilize a singular framework to support single delivery. And so with mental health, it's making sure that we're providing resources and interventions at the universal level and then intensifying those mental health interventions as we move up the tier. And so this leads to more appropriate referrals into individual therapy. And then I'll also show you how that is set up systematically. And so at all 3 tiers, we use data. So we follow that database decision-making model, mostly through our request for assistance form, right? We look at data and trends through our tier 2-3. Like I mentioned, our mental health clinicians are members on that team, but they also do macro level work as well. And then we also utilize evidence-based practices at each tier. And so you can see on the right-hand side of the triangle, these are examples of what our Monterey County behavioral health clinicians have done at various tiers at our schools. So for example, our clinicians at tier 1, so looking at data and finding trends, they are utilized in macro level work, such as providing school-wide SEL lessons based on data, maybe consulting with the tier 1 team if they're noticing trends in behavior data through SWIS, or socio-emotional data trends through the request for assistance form and other data components as well. In tier 2, that clinician is a member of that tier 2-3 team. And at some of our sites, they're also co-facilitating a tier 2 socio-emotional group, whether it's mindfulness, anxiety support, a curriculum-based group. But I should note that this is not a psychoeducational group. So this is not group therapy. This is really a tier 2 socio-emotional group that they can help co-facilitate. And then of course, with tier 3, our Monterey County behavioral health clinicians can provide individual therapeutic services, to referred students that they're not successful in a tier 2 socio-emotional intervention. So really we're exhausting all of the socio-emotional supports that we can give a student before referring them to Monterey County Behavioral Health for individual therapy. And so that way their referrals are more appropriate because we've already tried different levels of socio-emotional support. Okay, and these are our 2 demo schools in our district. So the first one is Salinas High School. And so you can see kind of the data and the stats for each school. So again, the first one is Salinas High School. The second one is Washington Middle School. I will note that Washington Middle School feeds into Salinas High School. So that's been a really awesome partnership because the clinicians and the student support staff at each school communicate. So they know when their students who are graduating from 8th grade and feeding into 9th grade at Salinas High, they know what services those students have got and really talking about what the struggles were for that class so they know where to start when they're in 9th grade. You can see that our high school is a bigger school. You can see that the graduation rate, what our percentage is for English language learners, as well as socioeconomically disadvantaged. And then we do have an inclusion model for students with disabilities, like co-teaching. And so they're in mainstream classrooms with individual studies. So those are our 2 demo schools in our district. So what does this teaming look like with the mental health clinician involved, right? And so like we know for Tier 1, our request for assistance form is a core feature of Tier 1. And so really building on what Susan already said of having a robust Tier 1. So this form is available for staff to refer students to the Tier 2-3 team because there are concerns. And staff is trained on what those concerns look like, right? And then when would it be appropriate to request for assistance on behalf of a student? So the Tier 2-3 team meets and goes over the different requests for assistance form. They utilize the TIPS agenda as we do with PBIS. There's a formal process to review students that have been requested. The MCBH clinician is able to consult on certain concerns that are more socio-emotionally based. And then students are identified on the form, and then they have a system at Salinas High where they color code which student support provider is going to check in with the student in order for wraparound. And so I'm going to be responsible for checking in with the student. And so I know who's going to talk about that student when we come back together and what interventions we have done with the students. And then of course the interventions are offered based on the problem behavior or concern. And so really trying to match to that student need. MCBH clinicians consult and provide updates on groups and then on caseloads as well. Okay, so let's narrow it down a little bit more. We're going to be talking about a Tier 1 intervention and a Tier 2-3 intervention. Both are based in mindfulness, as Patty mentioned. That was one route that Salinas High went last year, and looking at data. And so both have clinicians involved in these interventions where you can see it on the left-hand side. So for a Tier 1 approach, there was a mindfulness PBIS lesson. And so this was created by the Tier 2-3 team in also partnership with their Tier 1 team. And I'll show you what it looks like in the next slide. But it was made with the clinician. So there was different activities on this lesson, and this was given out to all students. That's the universal part of Tier 1. In addition, there were certain subgroups that were identified of needing extra support based on data. So the 2 groups that were identified were our newcomer students who are not proficient in English yet, who are brand new to the American school culture, and they needed extra support with their socio-emotional needs. And then also students that were taking academically rigorous classes that were really overwhelmed by stress because they were just overwhelmed. And so with those classes, the clinicians actually dropped into those classes at a certain time and then taught these mindfulness strategies and stress management strategies to the students in the classroom environment. So that was on top of having a school-wide expectation because those groups were identified. The ways those groups were identified were the request for assistance form, so data trends through that, SWIS discipline and behavior data, suicide risk assessment data, and Gaggle alerts. So Gaggle alerts is a software. Our district is one-to-one Chromebook. And so it's a software that's on each student Chromebook where if they Google like self-harm or things about suicide or killing in a Google Doc or on their Chromebook, the administrator gets an alert. And so that's another way that we can identify students that need extra social-emotional support. The ways we progress monitored were from the PBS lesson, there was a student feedback form. And so if a student needed additional help, they can self-identify that way as well. There was informal teacher interviews and review from classes that were popped into by clinicians. And then you can see the outcome data were basically declining. So declining in office discipline referral data through SWIS, declining in suicide risk assessment data, declining in Gaggle alert data, and then of course those teacher interviews and review. So that's at the tier 1 level. And then like mentioned at the tier 2-3 level, there was a mindfulness targeted group co-facilitated with a Monterey County behavioral health clinician. And so similar data points, but really the request for assistance form, specifically students that needed support with mental health challenges. And these students couldn't name a coping skill to help navigate their emotions. And this was after the tier 1 approach. And then they could also be identified through Gaggle alert or suicide risk assessment data. And then we have our qualitative data in the center where we have our student surveys and maybe teacher surveys about the student's disposition. And so that's progress monitoring to see how they're doing. And then we have our outcome data of they're able to exhibit mindfulness as a healthy skill, able to obtain positive outlook and express gratitude, and then other goals that we had for the students in this particular intervention. Okay, this is an example. So this is what the lesson looked like for mindfulness. It's a game board. And so the reason why it was like this is because it's turnkey for adults. So like Patty mentioned earlier, we just want to be mindful of the skill set that our secondary teachers may have or teachers in general. So teachers didn't have to teach students what mindfulness is. It was more of the student exploring the different qualities of mindfulness. And so that was really important to teachers. That was more turnkey, that they didn't have to have prior knowledge for that. Okay, and then just quickly mentioning some challenges that we're having this year in general. So having strategic professional development for staff, and sometimes our clinicians, because they're so embedded into the school culture, they can actually provide training for staff on trauma-informed practices, de-escalation strategies, things of this nature, but we're still trying to gauge and how we're going to provide strategic professional development, especially through distance learning. Our district is still in distance learning, so just letting you all know that. Really being mindful of teaching staff how to follow the referral procedures for requesting for assistance so that it is systems-based. Modifying our interventions for distance learning, we're still in progress with that. Creating data decision rules for all socio-emotional interventions. So the question we're asking ourselves is, what does it mean for a student to be successful in a tier 2 socio-emotional based intervention or group? In prior years, it's been, well, the student went to all the sessions. It must mean that they were successful. And so changing participation to actually having them meet a goal for that group. So knowing that student is successful. Okay, and then of course our next steps. So our next steps this year is training around for teams around a data tracker for tier 2, having decision rules for either fading support or intensifying support, and then choosing interventions that are matching the problem or concern. Of course, continuous collaboration between our county, Monterey County, our agency, Monterey County Behavioral Health, and our PBS teams continuous ISF meetings with our demo schools, which are facilitated by Casey and Esther, ongoing ISF fidelity assessments at each school, specifically our demo schools by our county and agency partner, and then ongoing integration and inclusion of our clinicians into our framework in our district. So we're very excited for that ongoing integration with our clinicians, and we're excited about that partnership. And this is me. So you have this PowerPoint. You can reach me if you have any other questions, but we're gonna also move into our Q&A session.
Thanks, Haley. I just kind of want to reiterate something you said, that game board showing the mindfulness with the different opportunities for students to interact with that. There's strong national data to suggest that one of the features that high schools struggle with is that 1.4 is teaching the expectations. And if you take into account what we're asking of teachers through an ISF, where we're asking them to teach some of these social emotional behavioral lessons, that partnership, and when I visited the school, you know, the conversation between the clinician and working with these high school teachers is, you know, how can we make that connection for them? And college and career ready is one way. So some of the skills that you shared, Haley, really support success beyond high school. And so giving opportunities, using your matrix to integrate some of that language, both your social emotional wellness, but also perhaps college and career ready, making those connections for teachers so that they see that this work really does contribute to the overall success of students. And so we have this up here, and we'll start the question and answer. This is a high school network. If you're not a member already, we've got all these different ways for you to join us. And if you click on those, you can get a little more information about it. But I encourage you to join. It's just an informal network of high school implementers. So thank you so much, Haley.
Yeah, thank you, Haley. That was amazing. I love how you really brought all these concepts to life. And I realize that a lot of you right now are very new to the interconnected systems framework. And what Haley just illustrated was really the step-by-step process that a school team does to work through this kind of approach. And I want to just highlight chapter 5 of the new monograph, because in that we provide a step-by-step process that Haley just described. And I think for many of you, seeing it in narrative form and then looking at the installation guide will really help you move forward in your implementation efforts. So we want to start asking or answering some of the questions that you have. And we had a ton of questions, Casey, around funding. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how this thing was funded and how you were able to flex out the funding to make sure that nobody needed a label, a diagnosis, or insurance plan in order to get support. So can you talk a little bit about that for us?
Yes, absolutely. So with our funding, because behavioral health, our primary, we bill Medi-Cal. So it's our funding that comes through the state. And so because a fair amount of our student population in the county does have Medi-Cal, we are able to bill Medi-Cal where we can. And then the school districts that contract with us, they will put in also some LCAP funding, which is local control accountability planning funding. And then with the special education funding, that's the IDEA funding. So in Monterey County, we have a very beautiful arrangement where all of the mental health money for special education goes into one pool. And then it is, that's how our services are funded. So if no matter what the need is for the student, we have these funding streams that are blended together. And so the other thing to note is that in our county, there are different Medi-Cal percentages for each district. And so we have a fiscal model that is equitable across districts so that it's based on the Medi-Cal beneficiary percentage of that district. And then the other piece to mention is that the Monterey County Office of Education has their grant funding as well. And so through our teaming process at the school climate transformation leadership level, we together determine what types of mental health trainings that we want to invest in. And so that funding is dedicated to whatever mental health trainings that we decide that we want to do together. And then that's how the youth mental health first aid movement began, is that we have grant money for that. So we pull it all together and then develop our programming in collaboration and partnership with one another. And then the other piece around the training, because the direct mental health services, those are billed by the minute to Medi-Cal. The training, the cost of my position as an administrator and my supervisors, they are also administrators and they do not bill. Our cost of our salaries are rolled into what the cost of one FTE or full-time employee position is. And so that allows me, with my mental health expertise, and the supervisors, we're all clinicians or social workers, we go and we do the trainings. And then as Haley mentioned, I have the clinicians that can also provide training at the site level. So we take the positions that we have and we're able to determine what the needs are for each school site, because it's going to be different. It's going to vary, but then there are some commonalities. So that's what it looks like in Monterey County. It's kind of complicated, but it is really based on the Medi-Cal. That's our primary funding stream, and then it's supplemented with these contributions from LCAP and IDEA.
Thank you, Casey. Again, if you're just getting started, you're probably drooling over the fact that Casey was able to accomplish this and pull all of those funding streams together. One of the things I think, though, if you can find somebody that's in charge of the funding in your state, so this is a state and a local county level issue. We're not asking schools to try to figure out how to fund this. This should be done at the district and the kind of above, with people who have authority to make critical decisions about changing how we fund. And we need to move away from kind of that fee for service model, so we allow our clinicians to have the flexibility to serve on our school teams and live within the education environment and be part of that community. So it's really about making sure you've got people who have authority to make some of those decisions, serving on your district community leadership team and your county or regional team, right? Those people are making those critical decisions up at the executive level. We also had some questions related to staffing, and people were wondering if you had school employed, school counselors already existing in your school. And then we also had some questions related to what extent did you have PBIS already in place? So can you talk a little bit, you or Haley, talk a little bit about kind of what was in place and kind of how you have your school counselors staffed?
Yes, I think I'll start and then Haley, you can pick it up. So absolutely, so the thing around behavioral health is we are one of many. Our services are for moderate to severe mental health condition, for the most part, for the direct services, but there are other mental health providers in our community that serve the schools. And so Haley mentioned about how they determine what referrals are appropriate for a behavioral health clinician versus other community-based providers. And so we want to, the thing that differentiates a behavioral health clinician from a school counselor is that we are providing mental health treatment, very different than what a school counselor is doing, but we actually work together with one another. So the school counselors build their capacity to understand what types of issues that can be addressed and what interventions can be provided at a lower level. And so the school counselors are very integral in this process, as are the school psychologists. So anyone that's working directly with those students and trying to help them along academically. I'm not sure what you would add, Haley.
I can try. I know that at our different tiers, school counselors are, we have one on the tier 1 team, and we do have a school counselor that's always on the tier 2, 3 team in order to help with wraparound, just making sure we're wrapping around services so that our different student support providers are not duplicating services. So it's also adding that communication element through. As far as fidelity of systems, we do have fidelity of systems with PBIS, and it was pretty integrated already. So we do have fidelity with tier 1 and tier 2. We're working on tier 3 at all of our sites. But like Casey mentioned earlier, this ISF idea to be embedded into the framework happened kind of early. So we started building while we were building the fidelity of PBIS at our schools. So the ideas were coming up and we were making tiny steps while the framework was being built to fidelity at our schools. So I would say they were happening kind of in tandem, but we didn't always know it. And then as far as the mindfulness, I know there were questions about the mindfulness game board lesson. The link is on the PowerPoint slide. And so where it's highlighted in blue, you can click on that and that will go to the example game board as well.
And Haley, I just put it in the chat as well. So
Oh,
people
thank
can
you.
access
Thank you,
it.
Patty.
Yeah, right from the chat.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you. So we have a couple follow-up questions around funding, Casey. So we've got questions related to, with that funding stream, is part of IDEA money, was it the CEIS portion? So I'm not sure if you can answer.
I can't answer that question. I don't know what CEIS is. Does someone else know what CEIS is?
I think it's the prevention portion of the IDEA money.
So the way that I can't answer this one, but there's one around the different billing rates for the therapists.
Yeah.
So all those
Okay.
different
I
rates
think,
are.
so for that question, we can come back to the specifics. But yeah, for the billing question, could you help us with identifying the billing rates for the therapists depending on what activities they were doing?
So those are listed in the MOU based on what the cost is per minute for each service. And then the other thing that there was some talk around the MOU, and that's a really important piece around how we want to be working together and having that documented in the MOU. So we do have the costs of our services are in the MOU along with all the other elements of what are required for our partnership. And so those, you know, the fiscal model, it does, as I mentioned, it's different for each school district, but the cost of the services remain the same. So we have really had to be mindful about the one thing for people to really understand is the more they get to learn about the different mental health conditions, and we're seeing so much anxiety and depression, especially right now, is that we want to be able to be really effective and efficient with our resources. And so if there is a student that is not needing our service and there's a lower level of support that's available to them, then we absolutely want to start with that. But then we do also, that's what my mission is, to be able to stretch these dollars as far as they'll go. And so the more that we can build capacity for the school staff to understand what the actual functions are for each service that is provided, whether that's lower level or higher level, the better, and the more that we will have to work with. And so that takes a lot of training and helping people understand what types of referrals are going to be the most, or the students that we're going to be able to help the most. So we have a pretty high acuity population in the mental and behavioral health world. And so we know that, you know, like it's been mentioned before, that we are seeing these increases, you know, suicide rates are really high. So if you take anything from this, I would say, please take care of yourself. Everyone be well. You know, the funding can get really complicated, but I think if you have buy-in and you have a commitment from the administrators in your district, if you are working for a district or a mental health provider, it really starts with the relationships, and then the money will work itself out, because if we can work together, then we're going to get much further than working in isolation.
Thank you, Casey. We have a lot more questions around funding, but I know that we're at the end of our time together. I think one of the things that we should all kind of take away today is this notion that I kind of started with, which is disrupting the status quo, right? I mean, things aren't working for many of our kids and their families. And so we need to take a look at the structures and systems and figure out who's making those decisions around funding and who's making those decisions around policy that needs to change, so that we can reach the vast majority of needs out there. And so I love the way that you guys described your journey in Monterey County, and in both at the county level, the district level, and the school level. And I so appreciate your time, Casey and Haley, and thank you, Patty, for giving us that high school context. We do want you to complete our session evaluation today. So we've provided the QR code or the link so that you can give us feedback. We wish we had more time with you because we didn't answer all of your questions, but we're hopefully you got some of those answered, and I think you've got our contact information so you can follow up with that. So with that, we'll say goodbye for now, and thank you so much for joining us, and be well.